Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LEC season finals, predictions, previews, awards, the whole shebang here at the end of the year for the LEC. I'm very excited to get into it. We do this for every single region. This seems like the best time to include a lot of the extra stuff that I kind of throw on top of things, but this will essentially be a full, complete overview of the LEC, not only over the course of this year, but of course, previewing the season finals as well. The 6 remaining teams that are going to get a chance to try and qualify for Worlds. One team obviously already having qualified, being G2 as your summer split champions, but we will get 2 others coming out of the LEC to qualify for Worlds as well. I'm excited to get into who I'm predicting that to be. In this video, we will also be going over all of my award picks for the entire year. I've already done, all pro teams, quote-unquote first team all pro teams for all 3 individual splits for winter, for spring, and for summer. I did that at the final week of the regular season in all 3 of those splits. You can check out those videos if you are interested in any of that. Of course, all you have to do is, go to my, week 3 in winter, week 3 in spring, and then week 4 in summer, and they'll be listed at the end of that video. But as I think the LEC does it, I'm going to be going over my yearly awards. They don't technically give out, split awards like MVP or things like that, and so I'm going to give you my, 2024 LEC MVP, my 2024 Rookie of the Year, my 3 All-Pro teams for all of 2024, and we'll get into kind of the criteria of that when we, start to preview it, but this is going to be probably one of my most controversial videos. I am not going to be surprised if this video gets a bad reception, if there are quite a few comments saying that, did you even watch the games, bro? I expect to get a few of those on this one because there are going to be some takes on the LEC that I just don't think are particularly popular or are particularly common. And so if you do find yourself enjoying the video, it would really mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. If you say hey, this guy's kind of going out on a limb and I might not agree with him on everything, but I can understand his thinking, it really would mean a lot to me. Obviously, you don't have to do that now, but if in, 15, 30, 45 minutes you find yourself enjoying it, it really would mean a lot. But with that out of the way, let's jump right into the content. And of course, kicking off our content is going to be our major awards. That's the 2 individual awards, and of course, we're starting off with the big one, being Most Valuable Player. I want to quickly go over my criteria. I will touch upon this very lightly again when we get into the All-Pro section with a few added, bits, but in terms of how I try to evaluate players when it comes to, value for their team and, how I want to prioritize putting players ahead in MVP voting or in All-Pro voting or things like that, how valuable they were this split, I tend to use that word, value, in my opinion. How many wins do I believe an individual player added to their team just by being on it? Sometimes you can be on a really good team and you can be a really good player, somebody that I would consider top 1 or top 2 in your role in the entire region, but your role just isn't all that big on the team, and I don't think that you individually are adding as much value as maybe some other player in your role is to a team that's maybe worse, even if that individual player I wouldn't expect to be as good in other circumstances. If you can understand what I'm trying to say, I'm going entirely based off of what we saw on the Rift. I'm putting a priority on regular season because playoffs typically don't, count towards a lot of these awards. I did definitely take some of the best of 3s and best of 5s into account, but I don't think it's necessarily fair to consider them in the same vein. That's just not how these awards typically work. They are typically regular season awards, and so I did put a priority on the regular season best of 1s, but again, like I said, I am factoring in best of 3s and best of 5s as well, just maybe not as heavily as some others. And also, I want to say this off the rip, and I'm gonna say this again in the All-Pros, it's more applicable to that. This is a yearly award. There were 3 splits. It wasn't just summer split that I'm basing this MVP off of. If you want to know my, MVP and All-Pro teams for summer split, you can check that out in the summer video, but this is going to include winter and spring. There are quite a few players that were really good at the beginning of the year, really good in winter and spring, and not as good in summer, and they're still gonna get quite a bit of love in terms of the awards here, because if you're good for 2/3 of the year, that's pretty darn good. It doesn't mean I'm projecting you to be great moving into the future. This isn't a player rankings video. This is entirely me trying to represent the games that these players played on the Rift, and, winter, spring, and summer are all going to be weighted equally. It doesn't mean summer's going to be completely ignored, but, it's not going to be, more powerful for me in terms of the value that I put on it than, either winter or spring. So those are kind of the caveats that I want to get out of the way, but all of that to say that going into our first major award, the MVP here, It's not going to be a surprise. This was the easiest decision to make in the entire video. My 2024 LEC MVP is Caps, the mid laner for G2. I didn't have to think about this at all. Honestly, quite frankly, if anyone puts anything else, they're just straight up lying. There is nobody in the LEC that came even remotely close to how good Caps was over the course of this year. G2 has been dominant. They've been the best team in the league, obviously, by far. They've won all 3 splits. They've won 4 splits in a row. And Caps has been the MVP, arguably, in all 3 of those splits. I know, obviously, I've given it to a couple of different people. He was easily the best player in winter. He was probably the second best player in spring, and depending on how valuable you want to consider the SK bot lane, getting that #1 seed in summer. Like, I had Rahel as my MVP, but Cap certainly could have gotten that as well. Like, he really has just been that good for this team. He has been the driving force for the best team in the league, and he's the best player in the league, and you see that on tape every single game. There is no question in my mind that he is the MVP. He's the most valuable player to his individual team. He makes G2 essentially unbeatable, and there's nobody else who adds the value that he does to any team in the league. So I didn't have to think about this at all. Again, I would be entirely surprised if there was really any analyst out there that went any other direction. I feel entirely confident that there just really is no other option. I will say, second place is also pretty locked in for me. We'll talk about third and beyond, because I think it's pretty open after the top 2, but coming in as my honorable mention, my runner-up, my second place vote, it's going to be Razork, the jungler for Fnatic. I feel pretty confident that he is a pretty clear #2 here for me. Again, #3 and beyond, I think, is very much up for debate, but Razork was clearly the second best player. I don't think he's anywhere near Caps. I don't think you can justify giving him the MVP over the course of this year, but I do think you can pretty clearly justify that he comes in as #2. He's just the most consistent player on a team that really has been able to do a lot over the course of this year, which is really crazy to say, because my biggest gripe on Razork going into the year, and the reason I've always been a bit lower on him individually as a player, is just because you would have to always trade those good games for the bad games. There would be so many games that he would just completely lose because he was bad at playing from behind. He's really kind of still bad at playing from negative situations. If he's down gold, he's really not useful at all as a player. Like, he is unplayable in those circumstances. However, he's cleaned up his early games so much that that situation just so rarely happens these days, and he is able to close out games faster than basically any jungler. If you want someone that's going to dominate, Razork is that guy, and especially with Fnatic kind of cleaning up a couple of different areas as well. I think Razork definitely deserves the second place spot here, but then whoever you want to put third, honestly, like, go ahead. There are like 5 or 6 different choices here for third place. I ended up landing on Lebrov, the support for BDS. I thought in terms of consistency, he is the one that I really wanted to highlight here. You know, I think you could realistically put quite a few players from G2 or Fnatic or, you know, some of these other teams that have been doing well, but I think Lebrov is going to fly under the radar, which is why I really wanted to highlight him here for third. I don't even necessarily guarantee that he was the third most valuable player, but again, it's such a cluster, and Lebrov is the player that I think is getting talked about the least in that conversation. And so what did Lebrov do well? Well, he enabled the best bot lane in terms of team fighting in the entire region, and it wasn't particularly close. Sometimes they did struggle in 2v2s. I'm not putting that on Lebrov. He's actually very good in the 2v2. He has been throughout his entire career, but in terms of just being able to play through the mid game and being the best team fighter, like maybe in the region, Lebrov is pretty high up there. He just doesn't really make a lot of mistakes, and he is really the one kind of creating a lot of the engage threats for BDS. He was really fun to watch over the course of this year. Pretty consistent. There were some dips in spring, but winter and summer in particular, he was amazing. I think pretty unquestionably the best support in both of those splits in terms of performance, and that's good enough for me to land him at the #3 spot here in MVP. But again, it's a pretty wide open race. If you feel like it's absurd to have Lebrov here, if you have him at like number 15 or whatever in your rankings, I understand that seems to be closer to consensus than maybe where I have him, but I really wanted to highlight him here because I think he's just undervalued by most of the community. But Razork, clear #2 in Caps, there was a no-brainer. This was never a question in my mind. He was always going to be the MVP. But then moving on to my second major award here, my second individual award, and that's going to be Rookie of the Year. Now, I really want to stress the year part of Rookie of the Year because I'm sure this is going to be a bit of a controversial take. There has definitely been some movement in terms of who my, honorable mentions and who was even in the running for this as the year has gone along. I don't think any rookie over the course of 2024 played a consistently great year. I think you're looking at, patches and stretches where things ended up going well for individual players, but I landed on my Rookie Rookie of the Year, maybe a bit controversially, being Supa, the AD carry for Mad Lions Koi. This is definitely going to bring out some Supa haters, because there are quite a few of them right now. Some of them justified. Like, I think some of the ones that are a bit more moderate are like, hey, you know, Supa could have been better down the stretch. In some of the more important games, he wasn't exactly as relevant as some of the other players, not only on Mad, but, you know, some of the other rookies in the league. And I kind of do understand that Summer was, you know, objectively his worst split, even if I do think he was the only player on Mad trying to win. In Summer, the top side of the map was just completely unplayable. Both of the solo laners were getting completely trounced, and Elyoya had his worst split ever. I'm not really blaming Supa for Mad Lions' underperformances. I thought he was a big reason why the team made playoffs in the first place. However, I do understand that when you're looking at rookies in the Summer split, he probably ranks like 4th or 5th in terms of results, but I just can't ignore the fact that through winter and spring, this was a non-conversation. The only conversation would be between him and his bot lane running mate in Alvaro, who is going to get my second place vote here for, you know, 66% of the year, really 70% of the year. Supa was the best rookie, and it wasn't particularly close. I get that he had that funny statement, I'm the best AD carry in the LEC. I think a lot of that had more to do, at least from, you know, my take of it, with the idea that AD carry in the LEC is bad. And honestly, he's right. Like, AD carry in the LEC is not good. This is the weakest role in the LEC by a pretty considerable margin. There's basically no consistency. And for Supa to say, yeah, I think on any given day, I can be the best AD carry in the LEC, I agree with that. There were moments where he was playing like the best AD carry in the LEC in terms of what he was putting out. Now, he couldn't sustain that over the course of an entire split, and that's really what's going to make or break his ability to play at a high level. We've seen this out of players like Exakick in recent years, where they've looked really good at the start of their career and just not been able to maintain that, you know, as teams start to prepare for them more. We'll see if that ends up being a problem with Supa going into next year, but at least for now, if you're looking at the year of 2024 as a whole, I couldn't really put anybody else as Rookie of the Year. He is someone I really believe in mechanically. I think he has the upside to be the number 1 or number 2 AD carry, you know, at the start of next year if everything were to go right. And then his running mate, Alvaro, is going to get my second place vote. Alvaro is definitely someone that needs less, I think, convincing. Alvaro definitely not as negative in terms of the public sentiment, if only because he didn't make those remarks. But, you know, the Mad Lions bot lane was the best part of this team for basically the whole year, and they made a finals. I know that feels like a long time ago, and it feels like something I shouldn't take into account as much as, you know, Summer split. But remember, like, winter means just as much as Summer in terms of these votes. And so Alvaro being at times one of the top 2 or 3 supports in the region, for the most part, one of the top 2 supports in terms of performances, that actually factored very heavily in. And I generally think the Mad Lions bot lane at this point is very underrated. We'll see if they can be able to keep that momentum up going into next year, because obviously I'm not gonna, you know, no spoiler alert, but I'm not projecting a ton from Mad Lions for the rest of this year. But the fact that they are in one of the top 4 teams, and they're probably the best part of a top 4 team, it's pretty easy to put them high in the Rookie of the Year voting. And then honorable mention number 3, it's going to go to Jackie's. Now, a lot of people are going to want Jackie's to be Rookie of the Year. I think he's going to be a very popular pick, and I honestly think, in terms of what I'm projecting for the LEC, he'll probably win it, if only because recency bias is so strong. But I can't overlook the fact that, yeah, Supa and Alvaro were, you know, really good in winter and spring, I should say, and not so good in summer. That's 2/3 of the year. Jackie's was good for 1/3 of the year, which was the summer split. Now, he was excellent in the summer split. You could maybe even make the argument that of individual splits, he was probably the best of these 3. His summer was probably the best individual split, but again, he was not very good in winter and spring. He had clear weaknesses. He was getting exposed by the best mid laners in the league. It really wasn't until the summer split where he decided to like lock in and really started to develop, and, you know, the team got better around him. Outside of that, he was not like a huge positive. He showed flashes, obviously, against bad mid laners, but not enough for me to he wouldn't have even been in this conversation, is what I'll say, if he only played winter and spring. And the fact that summer exists means that he is getting 3rd place. Like, I know that feels like a cop-out, and again, I'm projecting him to actually win it in terms of what the LEC will vote for, because recency bias is just so strong with the LEC, but I can't ignore how not good he was in winter and spring when I went and watched back some of that tape. Spring in particular. Like, winter, there were real flashes when he was new. Spring was a bad split for Jackie's. He just was getting beat left and right, and I can't overlook that. I think Supa and Alvaro were just a bit more consistent for a longer section of the year. I project Jackie's, you know, about just as good moving forward as these 2, but at least in terms of on the rift performances, Supa is going to get my 2024 Rookie of the Year. But now it's time to move on to my all-pro choices. This is going to be first, second, and third team for the entirety of the year. The same logic applies. I'm using the same kind of format and grading scale that I used for my MVP and for my Rookie of the Year voting, where I'm asking myself, who do I think was more valuable to their team, not who do I think is the better player. That is obviously a conversation for a different video. We'll do player rankings at the beginning of every split, as we always do, and of course we'll do that at Worlds as well, so you can get a better idea of where I think these players' like talent levels are, but this is purely in terms of production over the course of this year, and this really requires a couple of disclaimers at the start, because this is the part of the video, if I haven't already gotten hate for the Supa thing, this is the part of the video that is going to be every comment. Every single comment on this video will be about these three all-pro teams, or at least what I'm anticipating, so I do want to kind of clarify some things in this section. First of all, I guess I do want to point out, not all positions are created equally at the LEC level. I think that should go without saying. That should be pretty obvious, but some positions are just straight up better than others. I think when you're looking at mid lane, it was real hard to narrow down three mid laners that I thought were clearly the three best in the region, because there were quite a few mid laners that had really good splits or were very good for small periods of time, and so there was quite a bit of back and forth for me on that. I think that there were quite a few junglers that definitely deserve to be in the conversation, but then you look at some other positions and it's like, I struggled to find, 2 or 3 players that were good enough to be all pros at that position. I think AD carry is obviously the most obvious one here, because there really haven't been any consistent AD carries over the course of the entire year. You've had good and bad moments from basically everyone. Top lane is also just not a very deep role. Finding a third top laner, like top 2 I felt pretty good about. Finding a third top laner, basically impossible. You're gonna have to stick with me on that one, trust me. It doesn't feel pretty for me to put someone down here. It's definitely gonna be a bit of a controversial take, but we'll see how it ends up going. That is definitely the main thing that I want to say here about the all-pro teams. And then once again, I really value consistency. That's kind of something that I really want to put out there, is if you're really good for like one split and not so good in the other 2, I don't know if I can consider that an all-pro. If I think that you are actively losing games for your team, even if you are actively winning games for your team, it's hard for me to consider you an asset or valuable to your individual team as a whole. And so you'll see that consistency is definitely the thing that I trended higher up towards, as I usually do in these all-pro teams. But with all those disclaimers out of the way, let's get into the all-pro teams. Up on the screen now is the first team all-pro for the LEC in 2024 for me. This shouldn't really shock anybody with how I've talked about these players over the course of this year. This was by far the easiest team to end up deciding. It's everything else from this point and beyond that ended up becoming a lot more difficult. So let's go ahead and go over first team here. In the top lane, it's going to be Broken Blade from G2. In the jungle, Razork from Fnatic. In the mid lane, Caps from G2. In the bot lane, Ice from BDS, and in the support position, Lebrav from BDS. I think that this feels like a pretty obvious first team all-pro list for me. I think there are going to be people out there that want the entire team to be consisting of the 5 G2 starters, justifiably, I think, because of how much they've dominated, but I just can't reasonably do that. There is absolutely no way in hell you could convince me that the G2 bot lane deserves to be anywhere near first team, and so they're not going to get that from me, and I think Razork has been the best jungler, at least the most valuable jungler in the LEC over the course of this year, so we'll quickly touch upon the players we've already touched upon. Razork, Caps, Lebrav, we already talked about them in my MVP conversation. Caps is a no-brainer. He's the best player in the LEC. He was the most valuable player in the LEC, and it wasn't particularly close. It's just not even a conversation in my brain. Like I said, I feel like Razork is pretty locked in at number 2 for me in terms of value over the course of this year. He was a pretty easy choice for first team All-Pro, and Lebrav is someone who I've gone to bat for a lot, and so he is going to get my first team All-Pro support, not just because I've gone to bat for him, obviously. It's not just the bias. I do think that the gameplay backs that up. I think he was the most consistent and certainly the highest upside support in the league this year. Now, the other 2 we haven't talked about yet. We'll talk about Lebrav's running mate in Ice first and foremost. Ice was just the most consistent AD carry. This is where the consistency argument really comes into play, because when you talk about winter and spring, there is a real argument that Ice was kind of just a guy. Like, he was good. He was probably a top 3 or 4 AD carry in both of those splits, but he really wasn't winning games for BDS in the same way that players like Nuke and Lebrav and Adam were kind of making these big flashy plays and they were playing through their tempo. Ice wasn't really that guy. He's always been the same player. He just was able to do it more in the meta in Summer Split, where team fights were much more paramount. Getting to the late game was a lot more consistent as a way to win in the meta, and that's where Ice is good. He's really not all that exceptional of a laner. He's not really that great of a 2v2er. He's not aggressive really at all, but he is very good in the front-to-back 5v5s, and, he doesn't really make mistakes, and that, at least at the AD carry role in the LEC, is enough to get you first team over the course of this year. Consistency will really push quite a few players over the top. But then I've got Broken Blade in the top lane. I feel pretty good about this. He did lose a couple games for G2 over the course of this year, and that definitely was a bit concerning, but there was just nobody that could match his consistent upside. There were so many games where he just looked so dominant when he got into good matchups. There just wasn't any other top laner in the region that I felt even remotely was able to touch his upside and the good games that he was able to put out. And so it was a pretty easy choice for first team All-Pro. Again, we'll talk about it. Top lane and bot lane, they are the worst roles in the region by a pretty considerable margin. Bot lane in particular, AD carry in particular, is just not a strong role. And so if you have some arguments here, if Ice doesn't feel like a first team All-Pro player considering how he played in winter and spring, I kind of agree with you because the upside just wasn't there, but he was arguably the best AD carry, or the second best AD carry, I would say, in the summer split, and he was good enough in the first two splits to justify this spot. In Broken Blade, I don't think anyone's arguing that his upside was just higher than everybody else's. So that's my first team. Hopefully you can understand the reasoning. I think this one is definitely the least controversial, but with the easy one out of the way, I guess we can jump into my second team now. And my second team is going to be up on the screen now. You can see who it is, and this is where a lot of the controversial opinions end up starting. We've already gone over, at least a couple of them, but I will definitely have to explain it a bit more to justify them on second team here. But let's go ahead and talk about it. In the top lane, it is going to be Adam from BDS. In the jungle, it's going to be Yike from G2. In the mid lane, it's going to be Humanoid from Fnatic. In the bot lane, it's going to be Supa from Mad Lions and Alvaro from Mad Lions. And this is definitely where the conversation starts in terms of, I don't understand what this guy is watching, because Supa and Alvaro do get so much hate from the community. They are kind of, quite frankly, disrespected by the community for the most part, considering what they've offered. But another argument here is just the consistency that they offered. I get it. Summer wasn't quite as good as winter and spring for them, but they were still the best part of that Mad Lions team, unquestionably, throughout the entirety of the summer split. And, even if you want to say that that performance was bad, they were a top 2 bot lane for both winter and spring, and they only got really knocked down in summer. And so just in terms of consistency, I couldn't really find other players in these roles that I felt better about than these two. They grade out incredibly well in terms of the metrics that I end up tracking. They're good in the 2v2, they're good in the late game. They really don't have a defined weakness. They can struggle at both parts of the game depending on the matchup if you get a real expert, but they are kind of the jack of all trades bot lane of the LEC at the current moment, and they do end up making it work. And so, again, I've already talked about them quite a bit, but I understand that there is going to be some pushback to this, so I wanted to try and get ahead of it. But the rest of this I feel pretty comfortable with. Adam gets the second team nod in the top lane again. I just don't feel great about top laners. I feel like Adam's 2024 was way worse than his 2023. I feel like in last year, he was just so great. He was constantly winning all the time. He was so consistently the best top laner in the league. He just didn't have that same kind of impact in 2024. You still got a lot of the good games. I think specifically in spring, he was just kind of taking off and demolishing people, and there was a lot of really good things to look at there. And, maybe he had some bad games along the way, but especially when you see what my options were and what I'm sure you can guess the options are for third team, yeah, Adam clears them, and it's not even remotely close. So I felt pretty good about that for second team. Yike is going to come in as my second team jungler. I feel like he is sometimes just undervalued and overlooked because he plays for the best team in the league and because he's had, some struggles, quote unquote, in best of fives. I feel like obviously recency bias is going to play into some people ranking him a bit lower, but I just can't put him anywhere lower than second team. For a lot of this year, he probably would have been my first team jungler. He's just really good. I get that he gets to play with Caps and he gets to play with Broken Blade, and there are a lot of winning lanes and good opportunities, but he's a big reason why their early game, was so consistent before the summer split. Why, when things started falling apart, it was when Yike started to play poorly, and I think it really did highlight just how important he is to that team. I think he will be able to get some of that consistency back. I don't think the summer playoffs are indicative of the strength of G2, and I think when you look over the course of the year, it's very clear where Yike's impact came into play for the best team in the region. And then Humanoid in the mid lane here, this was the hardest one to do because he actually doesn't grade out particularly well, as he has never graded out particularly well. He's just not a player who, consistently is able to, grade out well. It's not the style that he ends up using, but he is a very dominant player when things end up going well. I think this is mostly for the beginning of the year for Humanoid. The last couple of weeks in the regular season in summer were an absolute disaster. We were waiting for kind of the Humanoid fall off that kind of happens yearly, if you will, and it did happen in the back half of summer. Luckily, he was able to get things together for the best of 3 and best of 5 stage, and he was pretty okay there, but you're hoping that he can carry that form, and he's just so naturally inconsistent. You can't really expect him to be great every single game. It's not who Humanoid is, but I think in terms of the upside, again, very similar to what we talked about with Broken Blade or even with someone like Adam on this second team, the upside is just so much better than everybody else that would be competing for this number 2 spot, and maybe he only grades out as the 4th or the 5th best mid laner in terms of the metrics I track, but I just can't justify that. The eye test is better than that in terms of what he was able to do this year. So he ends up landing on second team, although I do think it's a bit more debatable. But again, I think this is the start of where things get a little wonky for the LEC in terms of the entire year, but third team is really where they fall off the rails. And the third team is going to be up on the screen now. This is definitely the one that I feel the worst about, as is typical for third team, but I think in particular with the LEC, find me, 3 players in a role that were good all year long, like, good luck. Like, no way, dude. I had to go for the players that I think either caused the least amount of damage for their own individual team, or that I felt gave their team the highest upside to win games, even if they caused some damage over the course of this split, and we'll kind of talk about who is who as we go through this. But the third team All-Pro for me, in the top lane, it's going to be Photon from Team Vitality. In the jungle, it's going to be Jankos from Team Heretics. In the mid lane, it's going to be Nuke from Team BDS. In the bot lane, it's going to be Flakked from Team Heretics. And in support, it's going to be Jun from Fnatic. I feel pretty good about a couple of these guys. Like, a couple of these were locks, right? Like, Nuke, to me, was a lock. There was almost no chance that Nuke was missing an all-pro team. I think this is the best year of his career, even, better than last year. I think individually as a carry, he was given more responsibility. With the meta this year, it was less of a bot lane-focused meta, at least in terms of the early game and the resources that were attributed. Obviously, the AD carry meta, and I think Nuke stepped up to the plate and really, hammered home that he could carry games at the LEC level, and he could be a big positive for BDS. And so, I really wanted to give him the nod here on third team. These were clearly the 3 best mid laners in the region. I very much went back and forth putting Nuke on second team over Humanoid because he actually grades out significantly better than him, but I just don't think that Nuke was better than Humanoid, at least in terms of the eye test, and so I dropped him down to third team, but it would have been criminal to leave him off. There are other options here. I think a lot of people are going to point to Jackie's because he had that great end of the year, but I just couldn't justify putting him above Nuke when Jackie's was kind of inconsistent over the entire year, and Nuke was just very good over the entire year. So, pretty easy choice in the mid lane. The other pretty easy choice for me was going to be Jun, the support here for Fnatic. The only reason he comes in below Alvaro, even though I think Jun was way better towards the back half of the year and definitely had a higher upside, was because Jun's success really came in the spring playoffs and then onwards, like summer split, whereas Alvaro was good in both of the regular seasons of winter and spring. And as I said, I'm taking regular season a little bit more into account, and Jun was not good at all in winter. He was one of the weaker supports in the entire region in winter. He was kind of a negative to the team as a whole, and he wasn't very good in the spring regular season either. It really wasn't until the spring playoffs where he started to lock in and look a lot better. Obviously, that carried over into MSI, that carried over into the summer split, but it does knock him down a few pegs when you're looking at the entire year for me. He does come in as the third team support. If you wanted to put him second team, I do kind of understand. I think that is pretty justifiable. Really, the only other player I considered here was Luan, but he only played one split. It would have been really hard to sell me on that one. And I think a similar story can be made for Rahel. This kind of brings in the Team Heretics players. We'll start with Flakked, because I think this one is easier to justify. He was the focal point for everything they wanted to do this year. It was very clear with the direction that they headed in with their roster changes, with Trimby coming in over Kaiser, that they just wanted to try to play through bot lane, even in metas where that wasn't exactly ideal. And Flakked did do a lot with that. Like, basically every win of this split was Flakked getting super far ahead, or not just the split of this year, was Flakked getting super far ahead and just kind of carrying the game. They did also lose some games by investing too much into Flakked and having him not be able to pay it out, but he just graded out way too well for me to not put him here at third team. He actually, at least in terms of my metrics, graded out as the best AD carry in the region. Obviously, he fails the eye test on that regard, which is why I drop him down to third team, but just goes to show like how important he actually was to Team Heretics as a whole. Rahel is going to feel like a pretty big snub here, but again, he only played one split. It's just so hard to justify anyone being an all-pro for me in the entire year of the LEC when they've only played 1/3 of the entire year. It's just a difficult thing to end up passing. So Flacked's going to get that third team nod for me, and then his teammate Jankos is also going to be here on third team. He was the MVP of the spring split for me. I get it. He wasn't good in winter, and he really wasn't all that good in summer either. But if you're the MVP of one of the splits, leaving you off of all of the all-pro teams just feels basically undoable. He was just so valuable to what Heretics was doing in the middle of the year when they were still trying to figure out how to transition into the new meta, with Trimby coming in to play support, with Perks coming out, and Zviru, kind of really settling into that spot. Jankos was really the one to guide them through that direction. And again, if 1/3 of your split is like the best in the league, then yeah, I'm going to consider you probably an all-pro. I get that you want to see more consistency, but the other options didn't excite me enough in order to justify putting them above Jankos. Even if there were some other options that were pretty good, I think Jankos felt pretty easy for me to slot in here at third team. And then Photon, this is definitely going to get some criticism because Irrelevant is not in my all-pro teams. And that's really going to make some people very upset. But I've been very clear over the course of this year that I think think Irrelevant loses as many games for SK as he wins. His wins are so flashy and they're so dominant and they look so good that it's very easy to look at Irrelevant and be like, this guy's one of the best top laners in the LEC. And that's only if you look at SK's wins and the lanes that he wins. If you look at the losses that Irrelevant has, they are some of the worst in the LEC of any top laner. Like, when he's in a bad matchup, he kind of gets obliterated. And so I just can't justify that. Again, very inconsistent. There are going to be a lot of people that just slot him in to third team All-Pro. I can't do that. I am a bit lower on the performances that he put out over this year, and I just don't think he was as valuable as people make him out to be, even if I do think he is a good player. I'm not trying to undersell his mechanical impact, but when you're talking about someone who did just attempt to carry games for their individual team, Photon tried to do that. He was awesome in winter when the team was actually clicking. Spring was excellent for him. I get things fell off a bit in summer, and recency bias is probably going to leave him off a lot of people's lists, but this guy is just so freaking good, and he continues to be stuck on these garbage Vitality teams. If he was on any other org with any other group of players, I think people would be looking at him as a clear number 1 or number 2 top laner in the league in terms of talent, in terms of skill level. But because he is stuck on Vitality, I think a lot of people end up overlooking him. I implore people who think that I'm overrating Photon to go and watch some of his games from spring and winter and even summer to an extent back, because he is just solo winning games out of the top side of the map, which is something that a lot of players at this level just aren't able to do. I get that he might have not played as impactful of a role on a winning team as some of the other top lane options that are going to be kind of in the sphere here. Someone like Oscar Rinnan is definitely someone that I think people will vouch for, even if he falls into the very similar pattern to like Irrelevant. I just think he's a bit worse at it over the course of the year. But if I'm going off of my metrics and my consistency and the things that I value, Photon was the easy choice here for third team, even if I don't think he's going to get a lot of love from the rest of the community. So those are my all-pro teams. There are definitely some snubs. There are definitely some people that I think are going to see these and say that I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I've always been kind of against the community in terms of my thoughts on the LEC, so I wouldn't be surprised with some of the pushback. But those are my all-pro teams. We're done with the awards. We're done with going over the individual players. It's time to get into previewing the season finals by going over our matchups and our teams. And kicking off our coverage of the season finals, we're going to be starting with our actual matchups. The teams are going to come second because the teams that don't have a first round matchup yet are already in the lower part of the bracket. It feels weird to talk about them first, so I won't. We're going to be talking about our round 1 matchups, our upper bracket round 1, seeds 1 through 4. So that's going to be pretty exciting. I will not be going over them individually in terms of the slides. As I've said before on this channel when we do videos like this, there's really no point in talking about how good or bad this team is in terms of their style if they can't beat the teams that are in front of them. And so they're going to be talked about in the context of the series that they're playing. We will, of course, be talking about how they play, what players to watch out for, who they like to play through, etc., etc. We're going to give an overview generally of just, what the team is, where they like to put their resources, and how effective are they at actually doing that, and we'll talk about that as we continue to move on. But our first series that we're getting here in the season finals is going to be the top seed taking on the number 4 seed. It's the number 1 seeded G2 Esports taking on the number 4 seeded Mad Lions Koi, and this is an interesting matchup for multiple reasons. First of all, this is a finals rematch from earlier this year in the winter split. Feels like forever ago that we ended up getting that, but Mad Lions has certainly kind of been on the downturn over the last few months, and they've not looked all that great in the recent weeks. This team just barely scraping their way here into the season finals. Obviously, championship points wise, they did pretty well because they made finals in winter, but they weren't particularly effective in spring. They were good, but not great in spring, and they were not good at all, really, in summer. They almost missed top 8 playoffs entirely, and, had to get in there by winning some tiebreakers at the end of the year, which was definitely surprising, definitely not what I anticipated, but Mad's got a lot of things they need to work on. G2, not a lot they need to work on. We will touch upon them very quickly because you've probably heard not only me, but everybody talk about G2 a lot over the course of this year. Not really a lot of analysis that I can give that I think would be different, but there is at least some. But their lineups are looking like for G2, Broken Blade in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hansama at AD carry, and Mickey X at support. And then for Mad Lions, it's Mirwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Frescowy in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. Some notable things for G2 that I really want to point out. Obviously, we talked about the top side of the map, but none of the bot lane members actually got an all-pro nod for me. Hansama didn't, Mickey X didn't. Now, Mickey X, never even in consideration. Like, I never even considered him. He was not particularly good over the course of this year. I think if he were on a worse team with, worse players around him, it would be highlighted a bit more just how not good he was. For context, I think he graded out basically identically to Hylissang over the course of this year. I think they actually had almost identical performances except for the fact that Mickey was on a good team team that ended up not really getting punished for a lot of his mistakes, but I really don't think a lot of the things he did this year were particularly good. And then for Hans, he just wasn't particularly important towards G2. They didn't play through him. They didn't really ask him to do all that much. Like, I get that he was better in the best of fives, and that's certainly something I took into account, but not enough for me to consider him an all-pro. I think if he wasn't on G2, this wouldn't even be a conversation. This was not an all-pro caliber split from either member of the bot lane, and if you are looking at a potential weakness for G2, it definitely is the bottom side of the map. It's Mickey X getting caught in a lot of bad circumstances. It's Hans Sama not exactly being the most dominant AD carry in the world. He's very good at his one individual style, but this is a meta where his style isn't exactly all that useful. He is much more of a lane-oriented player, not really all that consistent of a team fighter, although that looked pretty good in the finals, at least in the summer finals. But if they are going to try to rely more on the 2v2, I'm not exactly sure how well that's going to work out for them. Lucky for them, obviously, they have some of the best players in the West on the rest of this team. Now, I'm going to address the elephant in the room first. This team did not have a particularly good summer playoff run. They still won finals. They're still the #1 seed. They're still the back-to-back-to-back-to-back champions here in the LEC. 5 of the last 6, whatever you want to say, right? But this, like, summer split playoff run didn't exactly fill me with the most confidence. Their early games were, quite frankly, horrendous. I think a lot of that ends up coming down to Yike in the jungle just not performing particularly well early. He is such an integral part of how they establish tempo early on in games, and I think with him not exactly being the most dominant jungler for a lot of the summer playoffs, there were some real concerns here, and so if that ends up prevailing, if Elyoya can actually have a really good series here, which I think is possible, then Yike could potentially get this team into trouble in the early game again. Like, I wouldn't be entirely surprised if those problems persist, even if they are a little bit more minor. I think the more realistic and likely outcome is that Yike comes out here and is able to course correct a lot of the mistakes that are happening in the early game at the moment. That's what I would anticipate. But again, Yike is a pretty big pivotal turning point. That being said, it didn't really matter for G2 because they are so much better in the mid to late game than every other team that they could go down 5, 8k gold in some of these games and still come back to win super consistently. The meme is real. Like, they are just so much better and so much more talented than every other team in the LEC that they get away with so much more. If their early games do come back and they are a bit more consistent in that phase, I don't think G2 is going to be all that touchable here in the season finals, and I think that that's a more realistic outcome. As for how they match up in particular against Mad Lions, it's pretty well. I think mid lane is an absolute black hole for Mad. Frescowy's actually played relatively well into caps historically so far over the course of this year. It's not really been all that bad of a matchup, but really the disaster matchup for Mad Lions is top lane. Broken Blade into Mirwin has just not been playable for Mirwin across this entire year. Mirwin is a player I'm just much lower on. Even during their finals run in winter, I was really not all that enthused by him individually as a player. I think he has quite a few flaws. I think he is over-reliant on these weird off-meta picks in order to be like an exceptional top laner. His grades are like awful, and that really influenced my brain into saying like, I just don't think Mirwin is somebody that I really trust all that much. Like, he is just not a top laner that I view as particularly impactful. Probably a bottom 2, bottom 3 top laner in the LEC, which is not a great place to be, and you're going up against Broken Blade, who at any given time can absolutely obliterate any series. He's awesome in lane, and he's the most dominant top laner in the LEC by far at playing from an advantage. When you give him a gold lead, he is able to just steamroll games in a way that other top laners just aren't able to do at this level. And so that is the matchup I'm definitely worried about for Mad, and I think G2 could play through, but bot lane could potentially be a problem. I don't think it will be. Hans has typically stepped up in best ofs, and I think this will be fine for them, but I'm looking for any sort of avenue to sit here and say, well, G2 could theoretically struggle. I just don't think that that's realistic. Mad Lions is an okay team on paper, but they're really just out of sync and out of coordination right now, and their players are quite frankly just playing below their own individual skill levels, most specifically the top side of this map. Elyoya has just not been good enough. He is way too important for Mad Lions for him to be playing the way that he is at the current moment. I think if he is able to get back some of that momentum, some of that confidence that he's had every year over the course of his career, that he had in winter, that, you know, was really kind of driving a lot of their playoff success, that's going to be massive for Mad, and that's going to be able to really let them establish something maybe in the early game here, especially if Yike is going to continue to not have a great phase of the game there. Frescowy, like I said, is matched up individually pretty well into caps, but he was awful down the stretch. I think, you know, Mirwin and Frescowy, and Elyoya to an extent, were the problems for Mad Lions in the summer split. They were the players that were just getting absolutely trounced. Mirwin, not entirely surprising, but Frescowy simply has to be better. He was really awful 1v1 in lane in particular, and the middle of the map right now is the most important part of the game. If your jungle mid is losing super consistently, you're not going to win games, let alone series, and so Frescowy's going to have to step up, Elyoya's going to have to step up. They are the two kind of, you know, I guess, turning points for Mad Lions, if you will, in a series like this. I theoretically could see a world in which bot lane is better. Supa and Alvaro, I think, have been more consistent over the course of this year, but again, Hans typically steps up in best ofs. Mickey X, somebody that is used to these high-pressure situations. Supa and Alvaro, not exactly the most confident bot lane at the current moment with how things have gone and just the amount of community hate, I think, generally that they are getting. I'm sure it's affected their performance in some way, shape, or form, and so not saying that it's not, brought on by their own words, just, trying to point that out. I'm not expecting them to go out and win bot lane. I think they could. I think that that's realistic and reasonable, but that's probably the only lane that even has a remote chance of being able to do anything. The rest of this map I just do not see as playable. G2 obviously won this matchup in the regular season in summer, as you can denote by the 1-0 in the middle of the screen, and I don't really see any reason to expect it to go any other way here in the season finals. And then moving on to our other upper bracket, round number 1 matchup. And these are the two closer seeds, and in my opinion, at the very least, a closer matchup, if not one that I would still expect to go a particular way. It's the number 2 seeded Fnatic taking on the number 3 seeded BDS. And, again, I think both of these teams are interesting. I think that there is a pretty realistic chance that these are two Worlds teams. I think that they play relatively similarly through different parts of the map for the most part, but both have kind of a similar idea of wanting to get into the late game. That's just generally how things have gone in the LEC. Fnatic is a bit more aggressive in the early game in terms of how they actively want to play games out, but both of them have very much established the way that they want to look towards the mid game, and whether or not they want to be risky or aggressive, neither of them really want to take that big jump. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Fnatic's lineup is of course looking like Oscar Rinnan in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and Jun at support. And then BDS's lineup is looking like Adam in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Ice at AD carry, and Labrav at support. So where do I think things break down? Well, let's talk about Fnatic's style first. They're probably one of the more quote-unquote aggressive teams in terms of the early game. They're not particularly aggressive in comparison to a lot of the other teams we watch in other regions, but for LEC standards, they are pretty aggressive. This league has just generally been a lot more slow-paced. Games are going a lot longer in Europe than they're going in a lot of other regions, and at least Razork and Humanoid are attempting to do things in, the early game. I think a lot of other teams are just willing to kind of let it go and be a little bit more passive. Humanoid sometimes gets caught out a little bit too early. That's always been a bit of a problem, is his consistency in the early game, specifically in gank situations where he just doesn't often respect the timings of other junglers. Sheo's actually really good at punishing things like that. We will get to that, so that could be a bit of a problem, but Razork has been an early game master over the course of this year. It's the reason he was an MVP finalist for me, somebody that was in the conversation, is because of his ability to play out early games, and if he's going to be able to do that super consistently against teams like BDS, then there's not really going to be a ton of pushback. There's not going to be a lot of problems from that kind of style, at least over the course of this season finals domestically, because there just aren't a lot of teams that have the talent or the mentality to be able to compete with Razork and what he's able to do in the early game. So I think that's going to be a pretty centralizing force. I think if you are concerned about a part of this team, I mean, top and bot have been concerning at different times of the year. Oscar, I think, Noah, they've both gotten better over the course of the year. I think they've both gotten more consistent. Oscar definitely had his best split in summer. Noah definitely had his best split in summer, and so those are some really good things to be able to say. That being said, neither of them are particularly consistent. Noah was really exposed in the finals of the summer split, where he just got completely trounced by Hansama. He's not really a player I really believe in, especially in high-pressure situations. He's actually performed significantly worse in best of 5s than he has in best of 1s or best of 3s, and so there is reason to believe that that is a trend that could potentially continue for Fnatic. Hopefully that doesn't end up being the case, because I do like Jun, and I think Jun is a good player, and he's been able to set up a lot of good things for both Noah and Razork over the course of this year, but it's just hard for me to really fully believe in Noah when the track record isn't super great, especially in high pressure situations. But Oscar Rinnan, another player that you just roll the dice on any given day. You might get a 1, you might get a 6, you might get something in between. He's totally capable of playing weak side and just surviving on the top side as well. But, he'll have the Oscar win-in performances where he just comes out and absolutely dominates, and he'll have the Oscar Rintin performances where he just comes out and gets absolutely destroyed, especially going into someone like Adam, who's very volatile. You just don't really know what you're going to get out of Oscar on any given day. Razork and Huma are the two players that are going to either drag this team up or not be enough to carry this team across their own flaws. They are going to determine basically everything. If Razork comes out and dominates and is the best player in the series, it's not going to be close. Fnatic's going to be able to win this. If Humanoid has a really good series, I think they're going to be just fine, but they could also just have good series, and the problem for Fnatic is that when Razork and Huma are just good, sometimes that's not enough for them to be able to win, and so we'll see what ends up happening, but the middle of the map really is the turning point, of course, for Fnatic, and then for BDS, BDS on the other side. They're kind of the opposite, where Fnatic is one of the few teams that's actually good at this level that is trying to play aggressive early. BDS is all in on 5v5s in the late game, and that's mostly because of their AD carry Ice, who has been their primary resource getter and resource carry over the course of this split. And not just this split, I should say, basically the whole year. Labrav has been the one that's been the most active in the mid game. It's the reason he was an MVP finalist for me, is because he's the one kind of setting up everything that BDS wants to do in terms of the plays that they end up creating. But Ice gets a lot of those pop-off moments in front-to-back 5v5s. The Zeri, the Jinx, they definitely come to mind. We've seen the Ashe kind of perma-banned out against him. I'm not so sure that it's worth trying to invest bans into Ice at this point, if only because he is so good at multiple different champions, unless you just want to take away all three of those in first phase, which I guess it's whatever, right? But he can probably play other things. I'm sure he can play Ezreal and Kai'Sa and, you know, things like that. And so I don't really understand the idea of maybe prioritizing that. I've seen, people just suggest that, oh, you have to get rid of the Ashe. I don't think the Ashe is so much better than the Jinx or the Zeri that you have to take it away, but those are definitely the three priority champions for him over the course of this split. Definitely something to monitor, but I trust BDS's bot lane if they do get into these late game 5v5 situations where they're relatively neutral in gold. Ice is probably the best team fighter in the region at the current moment, or at least he's in the conversation for being such, and then Labrav obviously very good in that stage as well. The other big, notable player for me is actually Nuke in the mid lane. If Nuke can just, be better than Humanoid, that is a gigantic blow to Fnatic. Now, I'm not expecting Humanoid to run it. He typically is very good in very important series. He's kind of the opposite of Noah, in my opinion, where he actually gets better when you get into these best of threes and best of fives, which is a good sign, but Nuke has been awesome all year long. I think underratedly good against every team that isn't G2 Esports, and I think for the most part, this could actually be a pretty intriguing mid lane matchup. If he's able to actually show up and show out, that could be big. Adam is obviously someone I've gone to bat for and really believe in individually as a player, but he's known to get tilted throughout a series, so we'll see if he can have those big pop-off moments. Oscar is the kind of player that, can get exploited, so we'll see if that ends up being a possibility, or if Adam is going to get exploited himself. We've seen that as well. A very volatile top lane matchup here. Shayo's a player that I've been significantly lower on, I'd say, than most of the community. I think a lot of the community attributes a lot of things that BDS does in the mid game to Shayo. It's really hard for me to see that when Labrav is so active on the map. I think a lot of the credit that Shayo gets is Labrav kind of doing a lot of the good things, but Shayo's an okay player. I think specifically his early games really aren't all that bad. Like I said earlier, one of his biggest strengths is actually being able to exploit people who are out of position. And Humanoid, Noah, these are the kinds of players that are often out of position. Oscar Rinnan, it's not like Fnatic's the most disciplined, clean team in the world. If there are a lot of mistakes in the early game from Fnatic, Shayo could be the kind of jungler that actually takes advantage of that in a really clean way. But outside of that, don't expect him to, actively carry games unless he's on the Viego. Just not something he really does. And so, for BDS, I think that they're fine. I think that they're an okay team. I think Fnatic has, good and bad problems, but Fnatic's upside's just a little bit more for me. At the current moment, BDS is probably the higher floor team somehow, some way, if only because I just don't really see a world in which a lot of their players end up completely collapsing in the same way that I could see both Oscar and Noah and even Humanoid to an extent having bad games or having bad moments. I just don't see that out of BDS, but again, I don't think BDS's talent can come close to matching what Fnatic can do at their best level. So should be an interesting matchup, but definitely one that I think will be predictable as well. But now that we've got our upper bracket round number 1 matchups out of the way, we still have 2 more teams that are in the season finals to cover, but they will be starting in the lower part of the bracket, so no matchups to preview just yet. We are going to cover them. We're just going to talk about the team a little bit instead of their matchup analysis, and that's going to kick off with the number 5 seed and a team that we expected to do better in the summer split. It was SK Gaming, and this is a weird team to try to analyze because on paper, they really are good. They're a decent team. Their bot lane is very terrifying to have to face in these very important best of 5s, and it's not like the rest of this roster is chump change. You could get some really good performances out of Irrelevant. You can get some really good performances out of Niski. There is real upside to SK Gaming, real world upside if things were to go right. The problem is not only just these players are inconsistent, top side of the map is very inconsistent, top jungle support, or top jungle mid, I should say, are all players that have all had bad games, relatively recently, but also just whatever voodoo curse is happening with SK, it's definitely continued. The regular season overperformers have continued to kind of live up to that reputation and not be able to get anything done in best of series. So we'll talk about whether or not I think that that's legit, but their lineup is, of course, looking like Irrelevant in the top lane, Isma in the jungle, Niski in the mid lane, Rahel at AD carry, and Luan at support. You can't really talk about this team without talking about bot lane. First and foremost, Rahel and Luan are the reason that SK is here. Of course, this team wasn't awful at the beginning of the year when they still had Exakick and DOS, walking around and trying to do something in the bot lane. I still think that there is theoretical upside for those two as a bot lane moving forward. I think that this was a horrible situation for them, but it is so clear that Rahel and Luan are the most talented players in their roles in the region. Again, if both of them had been here for more than just one split, they would both probably be first team All-Pro. What they were able to do in the summer split was unbelievable. They were so clearly the best bot lane, at least in the regular season in the one split that they played. There is so much hope and upside that they could potentially drag this team across the finish line regardless of what is happening elsewhere on this lineup and on this roster. The problem is that they weren't particularly good in the best of threes when they ended up getting knocked out by K-Corp. Surprisingly, they were a team that was supposed to go pretty far. They were the #1 seed coming out of the regular season in summer, and they just couldn't quite live up to that. If they are going to have the upside that they should have, if they are going to be able to perform to the expectations that I think, at least a few analysts, me included, kind of have of them, this bot lane is going to need to be the ones that make that happen. So we'll see if that ends up being the case, but you've also got the top side of the map. I'm a Niski defender. I've always been a bit of a Niski defender. I think he makes teams better for the most part. I'm not going to try to pretend like he's not very flippy as a player, but, basically every LEC mid laner is pretty flippy with the exception of Caps. Nuke, I think, has really locked things down this year, but, I've gotten pushback on this in the past, but what really is the difference in the consistency between Humanoid and Niski? I just don't really think there is a ton of differences between those two. I mean, obviously, Humanoid's a more talented player, and I'm not trying to claim that Niski is better than Humanoid. What I'm trying to say is Niski getting in trouble for his inconsistency feels a little bit rich when basically every mid laner at this level ends up not being very good for some pivotal series, and, it's just unfortunate that Niski kind of has that reputation as a multiple-time champion here in the LEC. I digress. He is somebody that theoretically could be a major asset or a major downside to this team, and you just don't really know which one you're going to get on any given day. I'm honestly a bit concerned about him. It's not really his meta, playing a lot of Tristana or, Corki. That's not really what you want Niski doing. You want him to try to move around the map and play for jungle. I do think that that's doable right now. I don't think a lot of teams are really investing into that style, but I think it is very playable to just give up mid lane resources and try to get your AP jungler ahead. But if that's the way they want to go, then they're relying on Isma to carry a lot of these games, and Isma's probably the weak link of this team at the current moment. There was so much hype and upside for him at the beginning of the year when he was really aggressive in the early jungle pathing. His level 3s were genuinely terrifying weeks 1 and 2 of the winter split, but basically every week since then he has gotten not only worse and worse, but more passive and more passive over that time, and that is just a death sentence. It honestly reminds me a ton of other players that have come in and just flamed out at the LEC level. I don't really have a ton of confidence in Isma right now. I think that if this team were to do well, it would probably be in spite of Isma, not because of Isma, and that feels like a sad thing to say. I just don't know if he's the kind of player that's going to push a team like SK ahead at this level. If they want to make Worlds, Isma's probably not a Worlds caliber jungler, but they have a Worlds caliber roster around him, so I guess we'll see. Irrelevant. Again, very similar to what I just talked about with Niski, his good games are just so good. I want to stress, I really don't want to be an Irrelevant hater because I get it. I'm watching the same wins that you guys are watching. I'm watching the same good games that you guys are watching. I think I'm just a little bit shocked that people just don't bring up any of his bad games. It's almost like a selective memory when it comes to Irrelevant. When he wins harder than any top laner in the league, and if you exclusively watch the games that he played well in, yeah, I could see a world in which you're like, that's the #1 top laner in the LEC, but if you're ignoring all of the bad matchups, the times he gets counterpicked and goes down 40 CS, and the times he just is completely, pun intended, irrelevant in team fights, if you're ignoring those games, then you're not getting the full story when it comes to him individually as a player. He can have those pop-off moments where he drags the team to a win in the same way that Rahel can, and that Luan, quite frankly, can out of the support position. He can have that same kind of theoretical upside. You're looking at a bit more of a downside than you are out of the bot lane, in my opinion. I think when he is on a bad matchup, when he is losing and not playing particularly well, he's not just a middle of the pack top laner. He's a really below average top laner in those losses. So again, the kind of story with SK is the upside, the high-end version of this team where Irrelevant, Niski, Rahel, Luan, even Isma to an extent are all clicking. That's a Worlds team. That's probably a top 3 team here in the LEC. The question is, are you going to be able to get that? You really only need to get that in 2 series across this tournament. If you can get 2 best of 5s where all of your players play well, you're going to be at Worlds, and that's a pretty good place for SK to be sitting. That being said, do I guarantee that that's going to happen? I definitely don't. I think that their backs are up against the wall. overall. This org's lack of ability to find consistent success basically ever since 2013 or 2014 has to be studied, the early days of League, and it's definitely frustrating for SK fans, but this might be their best shot in a while to actually get some international experience. And then moving on to our second team that's going to be slotted immediately into the lower bracket, the lowest seed that did end up making the season finals. It's going to be GIANTX coming in as the number 6 seed. I didn't think in any universe this team would be here in the season finals, but they continued to overperform. They make the top 8 3 splits in a row, and that is enough for them to end up making the season finals here. They did get that win over Heretics, which was massive towards their qualification. And I think it's pretty reasonable to talk about this team in the lens of they've just been getting better over the course of this year. The roster change they made going into summer clearly was an upgrade. Obviously, you can't necessarily directly call it like a one-for-one swap upgrade. It's hard to say getting rid of Otoamne is like just instantly better for your team, but the team got better in summer. I think the way that they're playing right now is much clearer in terms of the identity. I think they took away a lot of the determining factors that ended up making them a bit more confused, and they focused their play down one lane, and it's really helped this team out a lot. I think basically everybody has equalized out in terms of their skill level over the course of the last few months. We'll see if that can keep up. Their lineup is, of course, looking like the Antonio in the top lane, Juhan in the jungle, Jackie's in the mid lane, Patrick at AD carry, and Ignar at support. There is some real good to talk about this team, and it's basically impossible to talk about the good without starting with Jackie's in the mid lane here. They plucked this kid essentially out of a tier 3 in the Czech League, and they put him right in here. I think that there were some expected growing pains, but GX trusted their scouting network, and they trusted the upside that they clearly saw with him on Entropic, and they bring him in, and, you know, it took some time. He showed flashes in Winter. I think that you can point to, like, 1 or 2 games in Winter where you're like, oh, wow, Jackie's kind of really good for this team. The mechanics are definitely there, but you see him go up against, like, really good mid laners, you know, the top of the top mid laners, and he's just getting absolutely destroyed in those matchups. It's fine. Young player, very low experience. I think Spring was definitely a bit more concerning. GX in general, I think, had a lot of struggles. Bot lane was really bad in Spring. I think generally the vibes of the team were very off, and Jackie's was kind of a part of that struggle. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like he was, you know, keeping that team afloat. He was not particularly good in the Spring split, but you get into summer, and they make these changes. Antonio comes into the top lane. Juhan comes into the jungle to try and salvage something. Gives them a clearer identity of potentially wanting to play through mid lane, and it absolutely works. Jackie's was a monster, an all-pro caliber player over the course of the summer split. Like somebody that you can build an entire team around, and that's exactly what they brought him on for. We knew that there were going to be growing pains. We knew that it wasn't exactly going to be an instant success rate, but this is way earlier than I was anticipating in terms of a, you know, successful hit on Jackie's. It's pretty crazy to see how things have worked out for him. And if this team is going to win games or even win a series here at this level, it's probably going to be through him individually as a player. So, you know, that's where GIANTX's playstyle comes in. You want to talk about what they do? They play through Jackie's. They give him as many resources as they possibly can. They put him on especially some sort of AD carry in the mid lane, and they let him go to work, and so far that's worked out. I also think the top side's been pretty good. Antonio has actually been pretty solid over the course of this split. Now, the caveat to that is that the concern with Antonio has always been his mechanical ability and whether or not that's going to match up well against other great top laners, and so far, that's actually proven to not be great. He was really good in the regular season in summer, not as much in the best of threes. That's something that is going to have to be monitored if he continues to struggle in these important series and maybe can't go up against like the best top laners in the league, like someone like an Adam. That's going to be a bit of a problem. You know, we'll have to see if that ends up becoming something that ends up, you know, dragging this team down. I think it's possible, but at least for now, I'm going to consider Antonio at least kind of a pseudo positive. I think Juhan is fine. He is the definition of a facilitator coming out of the jungle, and I think that's fine for this team, especially a team that does really want to play through mid lane. That top lane can win on, you know, having someone in the jungle that basically needs no resources and is just going to be there to make sure that the lanes are going well. I think that can be a positive. The only concern is that he's really not all that good at these AP carry junglers, and teams really seem to be obsessed with those, but that might be a blessing in disguise. I think Vi and Sedge and Maokai, I think these champions are incredibly strong right now, and I think the teams that have really adopted those champions have been more successful over the course of this year, so maybe it is a bit of a blessing that this team can't play like Nidalee and a lot of Karthus and things like that, because it does kind of force them to play these tanks and actually play more consistent comps in the end. hand, which has really worked out for them. We'll see, obviously, but I'm not like the biggest fan or hater of Juhan. I think he's just generally fine. He's just a part of he's a piece of the puzzle, I guess is the way to put it. And then the bot lane. This is really kind of an important conversation. I don't think Patrick's been particularly good this year. I think Ignar is one of those players that just plays to the level of the rest of the team. Was really not very good in winter and spring, but was pretty good in summer. Patrick is going to be a big turning point. Like, the mentality of Patrick has always been something that I've questioned, because he has been like Teddy Light, as I've called him in the past, and I generally think that that is still a very accurate description. Teddy is actually kind of starting to ascend into something different in the LCK. I've been a bit of a Teddy hater over the course of this channel's history, but what I mean by that when I say Teddy Light, I mean a really good mechanical player that just doesn't have the killer instinct to take over games, is going to be put in good positions, but is going to wait for someone else on the team to like really capitalize on those good positions. And you know, he's not going to be the one to really, like, push the game forward. He doesn't really want to be the #1 option on any team, and that's continued here, but his role has gotten easier because he isn't the #1 option for GX. Jackie's is, and so when Patrick plays a little bit safer in these 2v2s, when he's only up 10 CS going into the mid to late game, when you're really expecting him to, like, do something, you know, he's been a bit more consistent in that stage. That being said, even that has not been as consistent for him as it's been in the past. Some positioning mistakes, just some weird decisions in the late game have really cost him consistency over the course of this year. There are problems for Patrick as an AD carry right now, and he's probably the weakest in this entire season finals, and that's saying something. I don't exactly think the AD carry pool is particularly good, but again, this team is going to live and die through Jackies in the mid lane. If he's able to pop off and look good, if Antonio in particular is able to step up, perhaps Ignar could have some really good series, I could see them winning a best of 5. I really doubt this is going to be a Worlds team. I think it would take some pretty monumental efforts for this team to win 2 best of 5s, but at the very least, they've made it here, and I think they're already going to consider that a pretty big accomplishment. All right, but that is going to do it for my season finals preview here. We've done the matchup analysis. We've done the team analysis for the teams that don't necessarily have their opponent picked out just yet. It's time for the end of the video, which is, of course, my full bracket prediction here for the season finals. Excited to go over it. I'll be giving some thoughts on the matchups, but I'm not going to go super in detail. I think a lot of this is still very speculative. Obviously, we're expecting a lot of these matchups to end up playing out as we think they will in, you know, this bracket. I'm certainly going with what I think I am expecting to see from this bracket, but there are a lot of different options and opportunities, so I'll just kind of talk about the theoreticals of these matchups. But we don't have to talk about a lot of theoreticals starting with round number 1. We know what these matchups are. We know who's going to be facing who, and these matchups to me are pretty predictable, at least for the first one. G2 taking on Mad Lions. I mean, G2 should win this. If they don't win this, that is unbelievable. This is the biggest gimme, in my opinion, in the entire bracket. I don't think there is a bigger disparity between two teams. I think you can make a solid argument this is the best team in the tournament versus the worst team in the tournament at the start here. So I have G2 moving on. Mad Lions is going to move down to the lower bracket because they are the lower seed. No matter who wins between Fnatic and BDS, they slot in to face SK. SK will face whoever the lower seed is from the winning side, and then GX will face whoever the higher seed is from the winning side. So MDK slots down there against SK. Of course, G2 moves on to winners finals. And then the other round 1 matchup, Fnatic taking on BDS. Just like we previewed it, I think BDS might have a higher floor, but Fnatic is the better team, and they should be able to take them down. They're going to move on to winners finals. BDS will be moving down to the lower part of this bracket. G2 and Fnatic very much feel like the clear 2 best teams, even if there is a tier gap in between them, which we will talk about later on. But that brings us down to our lower bracket round number 1, starting with BDS taking on GIANTX. We saw this matchup in the best of 3s in the playoffs in summer, and I'm going to predict the same outcome here with BDS going over. GX put up a really good fight in that matchup the first time. I just don't know if they have the firepower to actually be able to take down a pretty complete team in BDS. I think Ice into Patrick is actually a pretty big advantage for BDS, and I would expect them to be able to win off of that. But Jackies could definitely make things interesting if he does have an amazing series. He had an amazing one in the playoffs, but even then, it still wasn't enough. So I feel pretty good about BDS going over here. And then Mad Lions taking on SK Gaming. This is one of the more interesting matchups to me in the entire bracket, and I've got SK Gaming winning this. I don't think that should be a surprise to anybody who listened to me talk about both of these teams. I think SK is better. I think Mad's biggest strength is their bot lane, and you can make the argument that SK's bot lane is just straight up better. Rahel and Luan might be more talented than Supa and Alvaro, and if that's the case, I don't really see any avenue for Mad Lions to win unless Elyoya just completely starts popping off going into Isma, which I think is a possibility, but I think SK is just a little bit better, well-rounded. I think Irrelevant has the potential to take care of Mirwin in a very aggressive way, so I have SK moving on. That means GX and Mad Lions are my first 2 teams out and eliminated from Worlds contention. Remember, you just have to make top 3 in this tournament to make Worlds, and that means that one of BDS or SK will end up making that top 3. We'll get back to them in just a second, but let's get into our winners finals. First, G2 and Fnatic playing for a chance to get their LEC championship over the course of 2024, even though both have qualified for Worlds at this point. And I've got G2 going over, spoiler alert, I just don't know if G2 can be beaten by anybody domestically. I just don't know if they have the firepower, or if they lack the firepower. I think as long as they're locked in, they're just so much better than everybody else in the LEC that I can't really predict against them. Perhaps G2 just like throws away a winners finals as they've done before, just to go down into lower bracket and just kind of do their own thing, get some more games going into the rest of the year, but I don't really know. I can't predict against G2. So Fnatic is going to drop down into the semifinals, the lower bracket finals, if you will, and they will face the winner of BDS and SK. This is a Worlds qualifying series. The winner of this will be the 3rd team to qualify from the LEC for the World Championships in 2024. And who do I think it will be? I've got BDS going over in a series like this. I think it's very, very close. I think the matchup is actually super interesting on paper, because really what's, dragging SK so high up, in my opinion, is how good I think Rahel and Luan are as a bot lane. And if they can just be better than Ice and Labrov, which I don't think is out of the realm of possibility, at least if they can be more consistent in the early game. Like, if Ice is not able to get his consistent, wins going, I don't know if BDS can, actively just dominate games in the same way they have before. I think SK has a real chance to win this if their bot lane is better, but that's a big if, because Rahel and Luan just weren't good enough in that series against K-Corp to really drag SK across the finish line. If they are good enough, if they show that regular season form, then I think it's very winnable. To me, this is the closest series in the entire bracket, and it's probably the most consequential one. We all kind of expect G2 and Fnatic to be able to qualify for Worlds. That 3rd spot, I think, is really the only one that's even kind of up for debate. I have BDS grabbing it, but if SK grabbed it, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. Hell, GX might go on some crazy run. They can beat SK Gaming. If they end up beating BDS, there is a real world in which GIANTX, I think, could make Worlds. I think that 3rd spot is pretty wide open, but I have BDS as my prediction. I just think that they are a little bit too consistent across the board. I would expect someone like Adam to actually play really well into Irrelevant, so long as he's not getting counterpicked every single game. And so you've got your top 3. You've got G2 in the finals, but who will be meeting them there? Will it be Fnatic? Will it be BDS? I have Fnatic. I think BDS is good. I don't think they're that good. I think Fnatic is, like I said, clearly the number 2 team in the LEC at the current moment, even if G2 is a whole tier above them. Fnatic is a good team, and they know how to win. I just worry about their ability to play against, legit good teams like G2, and that's why I've got G2 winning the tournament here, winning the season finals. I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anybody, but why would I go for any sort of upset when I don't truly believe it? G2 is so clearly the best team in the LEC, and honestly, if they lose even a single, round, even a single series in this entire tournament, that's going to be considered a disappointment. That's how dominant this team is right now. I don't know if we've ever seen a team dominate the LEC or the top European league, the EULCS, as much as G2 is dominating right now in 2024. This might be the most dominant split in season ever by a team, and if they go and cap that off by winning season finals and, winning another title, there's just nothing left to debate. I think G2 is the best team in the LEC. Fnatic a close second, and I have BDS qualifying 3rd, but I think it's going to be close, and I hope it's going to be interesting. But let me know if you agree or disagree with my bracket prediction down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering every single game of the season finals, as is tradition on this channel, but we will also be covering all of the other major regions as well. LCS, LCK, LPL. We even cover the NACL Tier 2 over in North America, so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all